Good day, MAC3701 students. The purpose of this podcast is to explain the principles of process costing to you. Please take note that there are 3 podcasts relating to the process costing. The first podcast, we will be focusing on general aspects of process costing, calculating and completing the quantity statement. For the second podcast, we will be focusing on the calculation of equivalent units, the production cost statement, and allocation statement. The last podcast will cover the treatment of normal and abnormal losses sold as scrap, abnormal gains, shortcut method, as well as consecutive processes. MAC3701 assumes that you will have a solid knowledge of the principles covered in MAC2601. You are therefore encouraged to revisit the MAC2601 module if necessary. So let us get started. An organization that makes use of process costing system will at any given point in time have various inventory types at different points of completion. The challenge is therefore how and how much of the total production cost should be allocated to these inventory items. To address this challenge, you need to understand the following key principles of process costing. The preparation of a quantity statement or equivalent production statement, equivalent cost, and allocation cost using the production cost statement. To address the challenge about various inventory types at different completion points, we use the quantity statement to calculate the equivalent units. Therefore, only units are considered in this statement and not the cost. Based on the given scenario, the equivalent units are calculated by analyzing each of the following inventory types: opening work in progress, current period inputs, and closing work in progress. In analyzing the inventory types, although not compulsory, it is recommended that you use a number line for graphical representation. This number line will assist you to establish visualize the extent to which each inventory type has consumed the production resources. This is your direct raw material, direct labor, and overheads. Finally, because the inputs into the process must be equal to the output units, the balancing figure will always be an abnormal loss or gain, only if it is applicable. Let us use an example where all units are passing the wastage point in the current period using the weighted average method. For this example, you can accept the following. Direct raw materials are issued at the beginning of the process. Direct labor and overheads are incurred evenly throughout the process. Wastage occurs at 60% of the process and is estimated at 8% of inputs. Opening work in progress of 8,000 units is at 20%, and closing work of 2,000 units is at 90%. Units put in production is 12,000 units. The company makes use of a weighted average method for inventory valuation. I always make use of a number line, which illustrates all the crucial points in the scenario I need to take into consideration for a process costing question. The number line is recommended, but it's not necessary. No marks are allocated to the number line. By using the information given to us, we can now draw up the quantity statement. For this example, normal losses of 8% of input occurs at the 60% completion point. Remember that you need to determine whether the opening and closing work in progress already passed the wastage point. In this scenario, all the units pass the wastage point in the current period. The 1,600 are calculated by the 20,000 inputs times 8%. The 20,000 relates to all the units that passed the wastage point in the current period. The 1,600 in direct raw materials are issued at the beginning of the process. Therefore, all the normal loss units will have had direct raw materials allocated to them. The 960. This is because the normal loss occurred at the 60% point. The normal loss units will only be 60% converted. Hence, the related equivalent units equals 1,600 times 60%. That gives you the 960. For the closing work in progress, all 2,000 units were allocated in direct raw materials. However, they were only 90% converted. Hence, 1,800, that is 2,000 units times 90%, are allocated in the conversion column. Okay, let us use the same information to prepare a quantity statement where the first in, first out method is used. You will now notice that for the first in, first out method, the completed and transferred units of 16,400 are derived first out of the opening work in progress of the 7,360. Then the remainder is derived from the current period's production units. The 7,360 opening work in progress is passing the wastage point in the current period. Therefore, the opening work in progress units will form part of the normal loss calculation, and total units in the output column will reflect as 7,360. Because the opening work in progress is 20% complete, those units would have already been allocated direct raw materials in the prior period. Hence, the direct raw material column is 0 units for opening work in progress. However, as part of the completed and transferred units in the current period, the units will still undergo the remaining 80% conversion process. Hence, the 5,888 units in the conversion column. The rest of the quantity statement is explained in the same manner as the weighted average method. For this example, assume the same information as example 1a above, except that the opening and closing work in progress is 60% and 40% complete respectively. Spillage occurs at 20% completion point. You will notice that the normal loss units has changed. This is because only 12,000 units put into production in the current period reached the spillage point of 20% in this current period. The 8,000 opening work in progress units did not pass the wastage point in the current period, but in the prior period. Therefore, only the units that passed the spillage point in the current period are considered for the normal loss. By reference to example 2a, if the company was using first in, first out method, this is how the quantity statement will be. Did you notice the difference between the example 2a and 2b? Units completed and transferred are now split between opening work in progress and the current production. The opening work in progress did not receive any direct raw materials because the direct raw materials are issued at the beginning of the process. Opening work in progress would have already been allocated the direct raw materials in the prior period. This brings me to the end of the first podcast of process costing. I hope that by listening to this podcast, you understand quantity statements and the difference between weighted average and first in, first out method.